and welcome to ASCE Interchange Live. I'm your host, John Marston, a civil engineering source associate editor for the American Society of Civil Engineers. Thanks for joining me today to discuss ASCE's Bridging the Gap economic study and report. My guest today is Darren Olson, Vice President and Water Resources Department Head at Christopher B. Burke Engineering. He's also the chair of the ASCE National Committee on America's Infrastructure. Welcome, Darren.
Thanks, John. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thanks for being with us today. Earlier this month, ASCE kicked off Infrastructure Week with the release of Bridging the Gap, a new report highlighting the effects infrastructure investment has on American households and businesses. The study is conducted once every 4 years, the year before ASCE's release of the annual report card for America's infrastructure. First, why does ASCE produce the report before releasing the report card? And what are the differences between the two reports?
So the report that we just put out, Bridging the Gap, is really telling people and informing us, what does poor infrastructure mean to the average American and to the U.S. economy? The report card is more an assessment of our nation's infrastructure, which currently the last report card had us at a C-. I think it's interesting to put out the Bridging the Gap and these economic studies first, because it really puts it in perspective of what does this all mean to you, to me, to our neighbors, and to the U.S. economy to have poor infrastructure before we then talk about what's the current assessment of our infrastructure.
This year's Bridging the Gap report followed a new format. Why was this necessary? Why is this important?
So I think to answer that question, we maybe need to go back to the previous economic study, which was called Failure to Act. And that was really because for so many years, our federal government was failing to invest in our infrastructure, really failing to act to maintain it. The landscape has changed a lot in the last several years, obviously, with the IIJA and IRA, which really put a lot of funding into our infrastructure from the federal government. And so we changed because of that, we changed how this was assessed. And we looked at what are we currently at right now with these new funding sources. And then most importantly, where would we be at if we continued those versus just doing it as a one-time investment? So often when we talk about investment in infrastructure, people may think we just need a one-time investment to help us get our infrastructure back to a good state of repair. But I think what we're seeing in this report and what we really wanted to highlight is just how important it is and how beneficial it is to our economy to have a sustained investment in infrastructure. And so that's what we did. We looked at two scenarios with Bridging the Gap. We looked at where are we at with just these two investments that we had, the IIJA, Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, and then the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act. Where are we at with just those? And then where would we be if we continue that investment in our infrastructure? And so that's why we looked at a continuing to act scenario, and then what we call a snapback scenario, which would mean we go back to the previous funding levels. But it all kind of ties into where we were at before, right? Because before we were failing to act, and now we've acted. So we've called this report Bridging the Gap. So we're starting to close that gap in our infrastructure. And then what does it look like under these two new scenarios that we find ourselves in?
That's interesting. Yeah. So going forward, how do you think that this Bridging the Gap and the legislation such as the IIJA would affect the report card next year?
So when I think about the report card, It's talking about an assessment of our infrastructure, and we look at that under several different criteria. Um, we're right now in the middle of that process for the 2025 report card, so it's probably too early to tell what things will look like. But my perspective of having done this for many years and being a civil engineer for um, 25 years, these big infrastructure projects and moving the needle on infrastructure takes a long time. I've worked on projects that are many years in the planning, and then another several years in the design, and then a year or two in construction. And so it takes a long time of sustained investment and planning in order to really move the needle on infrastructure. And I think the IIJA was really a great down payment. It was a generational type of investment in our infrastructure. But we need to keep in mind that it really was just a down payment and starting to move the needle in the right direction. The key will be if we continue to act. And I think that's really one of the most powerful messages of our report, Bridging the Gap, is what can we do for American households, for our economy, for our competitiveness in the international economy by continuing to invest in our infrastructure.
Those are all great points. And how do you think that civil engineering professionals can take these findings, use them to inform their work?
So we, as engineers, we're part of the equation. In order to improve our infrastructure, we certainly need funding, but there'll be other components. This report talks a lot about the federal funding from the IIJA and the IRA, but there's going to be many players in this if we truly want to bridge and begin to close the gap. We'll never be able to fully close the gap in our infrastructure needs because those needs are constantly changing. But we as engineers play a role in this through things like new technologies, new ways for permitting. We can help expedite the process and do our part to help close that infrastructure investment gap.
Hey, a number of the infrastructure categories that are in the Bridging the Gap report, such as energy, highlight the need for more support. What are the most concerning categories that should be focused on, and why?
So I think the category where we saw the need grow the most was energy. And when we start to think about what has happened, even in the last 5 or 10 years in the energy sector, so climate change has now become something that we don't dance around anymore. We're addressing climate change head on. We've had probably 8 of the warmest years on record are the past 8 years. And so elected officials, because this is actually costing money, there's billions of dollars of damages that are occurring every year because of climate change. And so our elected officials are very smartly starting to change policy so that we are generating energy in ways that aren't producing greenhouse gases. And that has become much more affordable as of late. There are, I think, 22 of the states have net zero carbon goals. There are other energy policies that are really at the forefront now and several states. And so what that's done is that has made distributed energy generation, wind farms, solar farms, much more affordable. The price of both of those have come down tremendously because of the policies that are pushing us away from greenhouse gas power plants, essentially, in our generation of energy. But what that's doing is taking us what we used to be is coal combustion plants that were very spaced around our country to now when we are generating electricity, it is coming from all different parts. Here in Illinois, we have wind farms that are all popping up all over the states. There are solar fields and solar arrays, and we are essentially having to rewire America to get the power from these distributed generation locations into the customers that are going to use that power. And then we couple that on the energy side with an increased demand. So we have data centers and AI and electric vehicles that are using energy in a much different way than we were using it 5 years ago. So when we put those two things together, you begin to understand really the challenges that the energy sector is facing and the opportunities, really. But there's a lot of need there. There's a tremendous amount of need in that sector. And so that's probably the one where I would flag as having the greatest, at least, change in need since we last looked at it.
What would you consider are some of the other key takeaways from the Bridging the Gap report?
So I think the primary takeaway is that when we invest in our infrastructure, it benefits the American family and it benefits the U.S. economy because it makes things much more efficient. Right now, and when we look at the Failure to Act study, poor infrastructure was costing the American household real money. And back in the Failure to Act study, it was approximately $3,300 a year it was costing the American family. And that is in tire repairs and car repairs and having to get new food in your refrigerator when the power goes out. So these are all costs that are real costs to the American family. What we see is if we go to the continuing to act, and so if we not only take this initial down payment investment of the IIJA and we continue to do that, the cost to the American family, and I look at it as savings, we're then saving the American family almost $1,300 a year because the cost of poor infrastructure goes down to $2,000 a year. So it's, we see that, and even in other sectors in manufacturing and in the production of goods, we see that throughout our economy is that when we continue to invest in infrastructure, it makes us a stronger country.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Which industries are hit the hardest by underinvestment?
There's a lot of them, but I think probably one of the key ones is manufacturing. And when you think about manufacturing, if we don't continue to invest, it's going to cost the manufacturing industry $280 billion over the next 10 years because of what it's all about. It's really about two things. It's about producing goods and getting those goods to market. And that relies very heavily on all infrastructure segments, but really heavily on the energy and the surface transportation. And those are the two with the greatest need right now. And you and I may, if a bridge is closed for repair and we have to reroute around it, it may cost you and I time. We may be late to a meeting. We may miss our kids' soccer game. But when you're talking about the mass movement of goods and we have pieces of our infrastructure that are closed down, it can cost tens of thousands of millions of dollars very, very quickly because of that lost productivity. And similar with electricity and the energy sector, if that happens to go down, you and I may lose the food in our refrigerator, but when a plant shuts down, that loss of productivity for a day can be devastating to them. So we really see that a sector like manufacturing depends just so much on our infrastructure.
Yeah, what kind of actions do you think can be taken by civil engineers and policymakers going forward? How could you see this report as a springboard to action?
So we talk about the gap and we're all about trying to look at ways we can reduce this gap, and we all have a part to play in it. Certainly, the federal government leads infrastructure investment, and they have put in a significant down payment with the IIJA and the IRA. But then, states and local governments have a part to play in this. That funding from the federal government comes down to the state and local government. And do these entities have the capacity to use that additional funding? If we were to continue to act, and hopefully we will continue to act, are each one of our states able to have the manpower and have the matching funds to leverage this federal funding that's coming down? And we get to the private sector. The private sector certainly has a part to play in this as well. The private sector owns some of our infrastructure, and are they charging us, the end users, the correct fee for providing us that infrastructure? I often think about private water utilities that may brag about not they're charging the lowest rates, when really we should all be looking at what is the true cost of water and distributing that water to everybody. So and then it comes down to the engineers, and we need to innovate, and we need to talk about things like asset management and how do we take this federal funding and use it in the wisest way to generate resilient infrastructure. So really, we all have a part to play in this, and I'm excited as a civil engineer because I think we have a huge role to play in this going forward, and it's a great opportunity.
Well, that's all great food for thought and a great place to leave us here. So thanks for being with us today, Darren. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Yeah, appreciate this enlightening discussion we've had with you today on the new ASCE Bridging the Gap report. You can get the report at bridgingthegap.infrastructurereportcard.org. For more information on ASCE's Interchange series, visit asce.org/interchange. Thanks for tuning in today, and we'll see you next time on ASCE's Interchange Live.